Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to tackle a feeling that I think every single person listening to this right now has experienced at some point. It usually hits you at the absolute most inconvenient times.
Yeah.
Maybe it is 3 in the morning when you were just staring at the ceiling, or, and this is probably more likely, it is when you were standing right in the middle of a busy grocery store aisle, just holding two different bags of apples.
Ah, yes, the classic Apple dilemma. I know it very well.
Right. It is so paralyzing. You have got the organic apples in one hand, and they were grown without pesticides, which you know is a good thing.
Yeah.
But they are wrapped in this really thick, hard plastic shell
Yeah.
that you know for a fact is going to sit in a landfill for 1,000 years.
Exactly.
And then in your other hand, you have the loose apples. No plastic at all. But they were shipped from New Zealand on this massive container ship that burns bunker fuel. And they're probably sprayed with all sorts of chemicals. And you freeze. You stand there, try to do the math in your head. Which choice actually makes me a good person?
It really is the defining paralysis of modern ethics. We are just drowning in information. We can suddenly see the consequences of every single supply chain, and we feel this immense, almost crushing pressure to get it exactly right.
Yes, that is exactly it. It is moral exhaustion. I feel like every single decision I make, from where I keep my bank account to what kind of shirt I wear to whether I drive to work or take the bus, it all feels like a potential minefield.
And because the standard feels like it is set at absolute perfection and you know you just cannot be perfect, the natural response is to want to check out completely.
Exactly. I sometimes just want to go back to bed and ignore the whole world. Because if I'm not saving the planet with every single breath, if I'm not living this life of absolute moral purity, then I feel like I am failing.
Yeah.
And failing feels terrible.
That reaction is so incredibly common. It is what we call the all or nothing trap. We implicitly believe that we have to be saints. We let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And since we cannot be perfect, we just stop trying to be good at all.
Which is exactly why I am so incredibly relieved to be diving into the source material we have today. The book is called Better, Not Perfect: A Realist's Guide to Maximum Sustainable Goodness.
It is a phenomenal framework.
Just reading that title, it honestly felt like a massive weight was lifted right off my shoulders. It felt like a permission slip to just be human.
It really is a permission slip. The author is Max H. Bazerman. And before we really get into the deep meat of his arguments, it is so important to understand who Bazerman actually is.
Right, because he is not who you would expect.
Not at all. He is not a theologian. He is not some traditional moral philosopher sitting in an ivory tower just moving abstract logic symbols around on a chalkboard. He's a professor at Harvard Business School.
Which is a genuinely weird place to find an ethicist. You usually expect ethics to come from the divinity school or the philosophy department, not the exact place where they literally teach you how to maximize shareholder value and crush the competition.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but that is exactly why his perspective is so valuable and so grounded. Bazerman's background is deeply rooted in negotiation, in decision-making, and in behavioral psychology.
He looks at how we actually behave.
Exactly. He approaches ethics not as this set of rigid, glowing commandments handed down from a mountaintop, but almost like a practical negotiation with reality itself. He looks at how the human brain actually works. He looks at our flaws, our cognitive biases, our limited bandwidth.
And he asks a really practical question. Given that we are these messy, inconsistent, and let's be honest, often selfish creatures, how can we squeeze the absolute most good out of our lives?
That is the core of it. He lays out this really interesting landscape early in the book. He says that usually ethics books fall into one of two extreme camps. First, you have the normative philosophers. These are the should people.
The ones who tell us what we should do in a perfect, frictionless world.
Right. And their advice usually boils down to something that sounds like sell absolutely everything you own, give all your money to the poor, and go live in a mud hut.
Which is great in theory. Ideally, yes, that is what a perfectly moral being might do. But for 99.9% of us, that advice just completely bounces off. We are simply not going to do that.
No, we are not. And then on the completely opposite side, you have the descriptive camp. These are the behavioral psychologists. They just describe what we actually do in the real world.
They're the ones running the clinical studies.
Yes, and their studies constantly show that humans are tribal, we are selfish, we are wildly irrational. They basically hold up a mirror and say, look at how terribly flawed you are. But they do not necessarily give you a roadmap for how to fix it.
So you are stuck between one group setting an impossible, saintly standard and another group just scientifically documenting why we always fail to meet any standard at all.
Exactly. And Bazerman wants to claim the space right in between those two extremes. He wants to be prescriptive, meaning he wants to tell us how to improve, but he insists on being realistic about it. He is giving us a survival guide for that messy middle ground.
Okay, so let's formally define the mission for a deep dive today. What are we actually trying to achieve here?
Our mission is to deeply explore this core concept of maximum sustainable goodness. We want to figure out how you, the listener, can maximize the actual value you create in the world without burning yourself out, without requiring yourself to be a literal saint, and without feeling that crushing pressure of perfection.
We are going to dig into the very specific, actionable tools Bazerman offers to help us outsmart our own biased brains so we can just be slightly better than we were yesterday.
And to do that, we have to start by talking about his North Star. He uses this specific term a lot in the text. He says we need a North Star to guide us through the dense fog of our daily decisions.
But when he actually defines that North Star, he uses a word that I know makes a lot of people immediately nervous.
Utilitarianism.
Yeah, that word carries some serious baggage. When I hear utilitarianism, my brain immediately goes to a cold, calculating robot. I think of Spock from Star Trek. I think of ruthlessly sacrificing one person to save five in a way that just feels completely devoid of human empathy.
It definitely has a severe branding problem. Bazerman admits that freely. The fathers of utilitarianism, people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they were brilliant thinkers, but they were absolutely terrible at public relations.
They made it sound like a math equation instead of moral philosophy.
Exactly. But Bazerman, along with modern thinkers like the neuroscientist Joshua Green, they argue that we really need to reframe how we think about it. Green actually prefers to call it deep pragmatism.
Deep pragmatism. I like that a lot more. It sounds much more grounded and human.
It does, and the core idea behind it is actually incredibly simple and, I would argue, deeply compassionate. The North Star is simply this trying to create the most value for the most people. And not just people, actually, but all sentient beings.
It is a fundamental shift in perspective.
It is. It is a shift away from economic rationality, which is where I try to get the absolute best deal for me personally, and a shift toward utilitarianism, where I try to get the absolute best deal for the entire world.
So, in every interaction you have, instead of your default brain asking, what do I get out of this? The new question becomes, how does this specific decision increase the total amount of well-being in the universe?
Precisely. Now, here is the absolutely crucial caveat. Bazerman argues very strongly that we do not need to be perfect utilitarians. You do not need to run a complex calculus equation in your head every single time you buy a cup of coffee.
Because that would just lead us right back to moral exhaustion.
Right. We just need to use that definition of value maximizing global well-being as our directional guide. We aim for it. We use it to break ties when we are stuck. We use it to check our inherent biases.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more, because creating the most value sounds fantastic on paper. It sounds noble. But our brains are fundamentally not wired to do this. We are biologically wired to survive, to protect our immediate families, and to look good to our peer group.
We are wired for the tribe.
Yes. And Bazerman uses the classic trolley problems to show just how weird and contradictory our moral wiring actually is. Now, I know a lot of our listeners have probably heard of the basic trolley problem before, but I want to walk through the very specific progression that Bazerman uses in the book.
The progression is the whole point.
Exactly. The comparison between these different scenarios is where the real insight lives. So let's really set the stage here.
Let's do it.
Scenario 1. The switch. Imagine you are standing near a train track. There is a runaway trolley barreling down the main line. It is completely out of control. Ahead on the track, you see 5 people tied down. If you do nothing, they are definitely going to be killed.
Okay.
But there is a physical lever right next to you. If you pull that lever, the trolley will divert onto a sidetrack. But on that sidetrack, there is one person tied down.
The absolute classic dilemma. Do you pull the lever?
And in almost every single class, every survey, across pretty much every culture in the world, the vast majority of people say yes. You say 5, you lose 1. The math is undeniably simple. 5 is greater than 1. You pull the lever. You feel terrible about the one person who dies, but you feel confident that you made the right logical choice.
Exactly. In that moment, your brain is acting like a perfect utilitarian. You are maximizing the global good. You are looking strictly at the net outcome. But then Bazerman introduces the footbridge dilemma.
And this is the one that really messes me up. Same runaway trolley, same 5 people tied to the track facing certain death, But this time, you are not standing by a convenient little switch. You are standing up on a footbridge that goes right over the track.
And you are not alone on that bridge.
Right. Next to you is a very large stranger, and he is wearing a very heavy backpack. You realize the only possible way to stop that trolley is to physically push this man off the bridge and onto the tracks below. His body, along with that heavy backpack, will jam the wheels and stop the train. He will die, but the 5 people will live.
Now, I want you to really look at the math here. It is exactly the same as the first scenario. One person dies so that 5 people can live. But what is your immediate visceral reaction?
Oh, absolutely not. I cannot do that. That feels like straight-up murder. There is absolutely no way I am physically pushing a guy to his death off a bridge.
And that is the universal human reaction. Almost everyone violently recoils at the footbridge scenario. But we have to ask why. If the mathematical outcome is perfectly identical, 1 dead, 5 alive, why does pulling a plastic switch feel like saving people while pushing a man feels like a horrific murder?
It feels completely personal. I am physically touching him. I am the direct, active agent of his death. I can feel the push.
And that feeling you are describing is exactly what the neuroscience backs up. Bazerman cites the fascinating work of Joshua Green here. Green actually put people inside fMRI machines to study their brains in the specific moment of decision.
To see what lights up.
Yes. When people look at the switch scenario, the part of the brain that lights up is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That is the home of what we call System 2 thinking.
System 2. That is the terminology made famous by Daniel Kahneman, right? Thinking. Fast and slow.
Correct. System 2 is cognitive. It is slow. It is calculating. It is the part of your brain that does long division and algebra. It looks at the switch scenario and calmly says 5 is a bigger number than 1. Pull the lever. It treats it as a pure math problem.
But when people are confronted with the footbridge scenario,
the ventromedial prefrontal cortex lights up. That is System 1. It is highly emotional. It is incredibly fast. It is our ancient evolutionary alarm system.
it is the gut reaction.
Exactly. It evolved to keep us safe in small tribes. It screams, do not physically hurt people right in front of you. Do not engage in physical violence against a bystander. It views the active physical pushing of a human as a profound moral violation, completely, regardless of whatever math System 2 is trying to do in the background. System 1 just overwhelms the logical brain entirely.
So we literally have these 2 different operating systems fighting a war inside our heads. We have the calculator and the gut. And in the footbridge scenario, the gut wins a decisive victory.
It really does. But Bazerman introduces a third scenario that exposes even more nuance here. And this is the surgeon problem.
Oh boy. This one is tough.
Imagine a brilliant surgeon has 5 patients in the hospital, and they are all dying of organ failure. 1 patient desperately needs a heart, 1 needs a liver, 2 need kidneys, and 1 needs a set of lungs.
And time is running out.
Right. Then a perfectly healthy guy walks into the clinic just for a routine checkup. The surgeon looks at his chart and realizes he is a perfect biological match for all 5 of the dying patients.
I know exactly where this is going, and I hate it so much.
The ethical question is, should the surgeon quietly kill the healthy guy, harvest his organs, and use them to save the 5 dying patients?
No. That is the plot of a literal horror movie. That is just fundamentally, absolutely wrong.
But again, look closely at the pure utilitarian math. If we are being those strict calculating robots, 1 person dies, 5 people live, it is the exact same math. Yet almost everyone, including hardcore philosophers who claim to be strict utilitarians, says absolutely not.
So why is that? Is it just the emotion taking over again? Is it just System 1 screaming at us that doctors shouldn't murder people?
It is definitely partially emotion. But Bazerman points out something really crucial here. Our System 2, our logical, calculating brain, actually has a deeply rational reason to say no to the surgeon scenario. It is about something called second-order effects.
Second-order effects. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think about the long-term consequences of that decision, far beyond just those 6 people in the hospital that day. If we suddenly lived in a society where you knew you could be murdered for your organs just because you walked into a hospital for a flu shot, what would happen to the world?
Nobody would ever go to a doctor ever again.
Exactly. The entire global healthcare system would instantly collapse. Trust in medical professionals would completely evaporate. Fear and paranoia would rule society. Preventable diseases would run rampant.
The ripple effects would be catastrophic.
So in the long run, adopting a rule that says surgeons can harvest healthy people would actually destroy massive, incalculable amounts of value. It would cause exponentially more death and suffering than it would ever save.
Okay. So we are not just being irrational hypocrites when we reject the surgeon scenario. We are actually, subconsciously, protecting the long-term stability of human society.
Correct. And this is Bazerman's most vital takeaway from this whole trolley tour. He says we do not need to accept the horrifying surgeon scenario or the footbridge scenario to still use utilitarianism as our North Star.
We can be practical about it.
Yes, we can absolutely aim for the maximum global good while still heavily respecting basic human rights, societal rules, and cultural norms, because those very rules are what create long-term stability and value. We can strive to be better without having to act like perfectly logical, terrifying robots.
That is a huge relief. Because I really, really do not want to ever push anyone off a bridge.
I think we all agree on that.
But okay, so we have firmly established that we have these two brain systems, System 1 and System 2. And Bazerman argues that System 1, our gut feeling, often tricks us into being far less ethical than we actually want to be. Especially when we are not dealing with crazy, drastic scenarios like runaway trolleys, but just the mundane, everyday decisions we make.
Yes, exactly. He refers to these tricks as cognitive barriers. Our human brain is just full of evolutionary bugs that constantly prevent us from seeing where the real value is in the world.
And the first major bug he talks about is something called innumeracy. I absolutely love this word. It is basically like illiteracy, but for numbers instead of letters.
It is our brain's fundamental inability to deal with numbers, especially very large numbers. When we are in a highly emotional context, our brains just sort of short circuit and go completely blank.
He describes this fascinating study in the book about saving birds from oil ponds. And I think this illustrates the concept perfectly. So the researchers took 3 different groups of people.
Right, the bird study.
They asked Group 1 a simple question. How much money would you be willing to pay to save 2,000 birds from drowning in toxic oil ponds?
Okay, 2,000 birds.
Then they asked Group 2 a slightly different question. How much would you pay to save 20,000 birds? And finally, they asked Group 3, how much would you pay to save 200,000 birds?
Now, if we just stop and think about this logically for a second, if you care about birds at all, the objective value of saving 200,000 birds is mathematically 100 times greater than the value of saving 2,000 birds.
Right. It is basic multiplication.
So if you were willing to pay, say, $10 to save the 2,000 birds, you should theoretically be willing to pay $1,000 to save the 200,000. The real-world impact is just massively larger.
But that is not what happened in this study at all. Group 1, the people asked about 2,000 birds, offered an average of about $80. Group 2, the 20,000 birds group, offered about $78. And Group 3, the 200,000 birds group, offered $88.
The line is completely flat. It is basically the exact same amount of money across the board.
The actual number of birds dying simply did not matter to them at all. 2,000 or 200,000, it was the exact same check being written.
This phenomenon is what behavioral psychologists call scope neglect. Our brains, and specifically our emotional system 1, literally cannot visualize 200,000 birds. It is too big of a number. It just becomes an abstract blur.
So what are we actually seeing in our minds?
What we visualize is one single bird. We see a vivid mental image of one sad, helpless bird covered in thick black oil, desperately struggling to breathe. And we pay money to fix that one specific image. We are paying to experience the warm glow of feeling like a helper. We are not paying for the actual mathematical impact of the help itself.
Wow, so we are just buying a feeling. We are not buying a measurable result.
Exactly. We are buying the internal psychological satisfaction of being able to say to ourselves, I helped today. And once we reach the financial threshold that buys that satisfaction, which was around $80 in this particular study, we just stop.
The math doesn't push us further.
No. The actual grim reality of the other 198,000 drowning birds simply does not register on an emotional level.
And this concept leads directly into another major barrier he discusses, the identifiable victim effect, which is probably the most famous and most heavily exploited bias in the entire charity sector.
Ah, yes, the Rokia study. This is a foundational piece of research.
Right, so in this study, people were given the opportunity to donate money to a charitable cause. One group of participants was given a brochure full of stark statistics. It said things like, food shortages in Malawi are currently affecting 3 million children. Severe rainfall deficits in Zambia are causing massive crop failure. It was just heavy facts and hard data.
It was incredibly dry, important, obviously. It described suffering on a massive societal scale, but it was presented very dryly.
The other group was shown a completely different brochure. It featured a photograph of one single 7-year-old girl named Rokia. And the text just said, your life will be changed for the better. You can help feed her. You can provide her with an education. There were absolutely no broad statistics, just Rokia.
And let me guess, the brochure with Rokia raised substantially more money.
It raised twice as much money. 46% of the people who saw Rokia contributed, while only 23% of the people who saw the statistics for the 3 million victims contributed.
It is wildly, frustratingly irrational, isn't it? 3 million actual human beings are actively suffering in the first example. Just one person is suffering in the second example. But the one single person gets all the funding.
It honestly makes me feel a bit bad about myself. It implies that deep down, I do not actually care about those 3 million
No.
people.
No, it is not that you do not care. You have to give yourself some grace here. It is that your brain literally cannot feel them. We are deeply social creatures. We fiercely crave one-on-one connection. We completely fail to feel real empathy for a spreadsheet or a statistic.
It is like that famous quote.
Exactly, the one usually attributed to Stalin. One death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. It is a dark thought, but neurologically, it is quite accurate. But Bazerman argues that if we truly want to be better, we have to actively overcome this biological glitch.
You cannot just accept it.
Right. We have to intellectually, deliberately override it using System 2. We have to sit down and force ourselves to realize that every single one of those 3 million nameless people in the statistic is a Rokia to someone else. They're just as real, and their suffering is just as valid.
Because if we do not override it, this bias leads directly to what he calls ineffective altruism. We end up donating our money to a local opera house or local animal shelter down the street simply because we can physically see the building.
Yeah.
We can go pet the dogs. We get those immediate warm fuzzies.
Yes.
But meanwhile, we completely ignore things like malaria prevention in sub-Saharan Africa, where that exact same dollar amount might actually save a literal human life. We ignore it just because that life is invisible to us on a daily basis.
It is the eternal conflict between connection and impact. We naturally want to help those we can see and touch. But the people who need our help the places where our marginal dollar does the most measurable good, are very often the people we will never, ever see.
And that ties right into another concept Bazerman talks about, the curse of knowledge, or what he sometimes calls the illusory transparency of intent. Basically, we are completely locked inside our own perspective. We severely struggle to understand the actual needs of people who are far away or whose lives look different from ours.
So we have established pretty firmly that our brains are just naturally terrible at this. We are naturally innumerate. We are heavily biased toward the cute kid we can see on a poster, and we systematically ignore the suffering masses we cannot see. So the million-dollar question is, how do we actually fix it? Because we cannot just magically will ourselves to be smarter or more empathetic.
No, pure willpower is definitely not enough. Bazerman suggests we need very specific tools. He calls them tools for active intelligence. We need strategies to deliberately wake up System 2 and put it in the driver's seat. And his first major strategy is something called joint evaluation.
This is such a powerful, practical concept. The basic rule of thumb is this: you should never, ever judge something in total isolation.
He uses the job offer experiment to illustrate this, and honestly, this one really clicked for me regarding how I make my own career decisions.
It is a brilliantly designed study. The researchers asked participants to evaluate hypothetical job offers. So imagine Job A. It involves work that is socially fair and generally good for the world. Maybe you are working for a reputable nonprofit, but it pays a somewhat lower salary.
Okay, I can picture Joe Bay. Good vibes, less money.
Then they asked them to imagine Job B. This job pays significantly more money, but the work environment is known to be socially unfair. Maybe you find out you are being paid much more than your coworkers for the exact same work, or maybe the company has a terrible environmental reputation.
Got it. Joe B is morally gray, but very lucrative.
When people were asked to look at these jobs in complete isolation, meaning one group only saw Job A and a totally different group only saw Job B, they tended to rely heavily on their gut, their system one.
How did that play out?
Well, when looking at Job A all by itself, they focused entirely on the fairness aspect and rated the job very highly. But when a different group looked at Job B all by itself, they often rejected it out of hand because the feeling of unfairness just felt too gross to accept.
But what happens when they actually look at both of them together?
When they put the jobs side by side on the table, which is joint evaluation, everything changed. Suddenly, System 2 kicks in, you start comparing the actual attributes rationally, you look at the hard salary difference, you realize, wait a second, Joe B pays $30,000 more a year.
And $30,000 is a lot of money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And often people realized they could take the higher paying, unfair job and then deliberately use that extra $30,000 to do a massive amount of good elsewhere in the world. They could donate it to highly effective charities.
Or they could simply see the real trade-offs more clearly rather than just reacting to the vibe of the job.
Exactly. The key insight here is that looking at things in isolation makes us deeply emotional. We react to the narrative or the story of the job, but looking at things side by side forces us to be rational and utilitarian. We react to the actual data.
So the practical application here is pretty obvious. If I am hiring someone for my team, I should never just look at one resume at a time.
Absolutely not. If you look at one single candidate in isolation, you might fall back on hidden stereotypes or that vague gut feeling, which, let's be honest, is very often just implicit bias disguised as intuition. You think, oh, this guy reminds me of myself at that age. That is pure System 1.
Right, it is the comfort of familiarity.
But if you force yourself to compare three candidates side by side by side, you are fundamentally forced to compare their actual skills, their years of experience, and their hard data points. You automatically become more objective and fair.
That is a super practical tip for anyone in management. Never evaluate anything in a vacuum. Always, always have a comparison point.
Precisely. Now, the second major tool Bazerman offers is a heavy hitter pulled straight from political philosophy. It is called the veil of ignorance.
John Rawls. I vaguely remember this from an intro philosophy class in college, but Bazerman actually applies it in a really practical way here.
He really does. The core idea is a thought experiment. Imagine you are tasked with designing a brand new society from scratch. You have to decide the tax rates, the property laws, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, everything.
Okay, I am the architect of society.
But there is a massive catch.
Yeah.
You have to design this entire society from behind a veil of ignorance.
Which means I do not actually know who I am going to be once I am placed inside this new world.
Exactly. You do not know if you will be born incredibly rich or devastatingly poor. You do not know if you will be a genius or have a severe learning disability. You do not know if you will be male, female, or non-binary. You do not know your race. You do not know if you will be a star athlete or someone suffering from chronic pain.
So if I decide to design a system where the poor are treated terribly or where sick people cannot get medicine, I am taking a massive personal risk because I might end up being that poor sick person.
Exactly. So purely out of self-interest, what kind of system would you naturally design? You would design a system that maximizes fairness and well-being for absolutely everyone, but particularly focusing on protecting the most vulnerable people, just in case that vulnerable person turns out to be you.
It is an incredible trick. It literally forces you to align your own inherent selfishness with the greater good of humanity.
It is brilliant. And Bazerman actually applies this concept right back to the surgeon problem we talked about earlier.
Oh, that is interesting. How does the veil change the surgeon problem?
Imagine you are back behind that veil of ignorance. You are about to enter the hospital scenario, but you do not know which role you will play. You do not know if you are going to be the skilled surgeon or the healthy guy walking in for a checkup or one of the 5 dying patients in the beds.
Okay.
You have to make a binding rule right now. Is it legally and morally okay to harvest organs from one healthy person to save 5?
Well, let's just look at the raw odds. There is a 1 in 7 chance I am the surgeon. There is a 1 in 7 chance I am the healthy guy whose organs get harvested. But there is a 5 in 7 chance that I am one of the dying patients who desperately needs an organ.
Right. So statistically speaking, if your only goal is to survive the day, you might actually vote for the utilitarian outcome. You might look at the odds and say, yes, harvest the organs to save the 5, because I am highly likely to be one of the 5.
That is wild to think about. It completely flips my entire moral intuition upside down. When I know I am me, safely standing outside the hospital room, I say no, absolutely do not kill the healthy guy. But if I am behind the veil, playing the odds, I say yes, play the numbers.
It really exposes how much our moral intuition is very often just a disguised fear of being the victim. The veil strips that personal fear away. Now, obviously, in the real world, we cannot magically step behind a literal veil of ignorance, but we can simulate its effects by deliberately removing identity from our decision-making processes.
How do we do that practically?
Bazerman talks about a famous historical example regarding symphony orchestra auditions. This is a classic case study in removing identity.
Oh, yes, the blind auditions. I have heard bits and pieces of this story.
Back in the 1970s and 80s, major top-tier orchestras were almost entirely dominated by men, and the casting directors aggressively insisted it wasn't sexism. They genuinely believed they were just picking the best talent. They said things like, "I just trust my ear. I know musical excellence when I hear it."
Which is textbook System 1 justification. Trusting the gut.
Exactly. Then, to prove a point, they started putting up a physical screen during the auditions. The judges could clearly hear the music being played, but they could not see the actual musician. They even went so far as to put down thick carpets on the stage so the judges could not hear the telltale click of high heels versus men's flat shoes.
They totally blinded the process on
Yeah.
what happened to the numbers.
Female representation in these orchestras jumped from less than 10% to huge, significant numbers almost overnight. Today, many major orchestras are around 50% women.
That is staggering.
It proved definitively that the bias was heavily visual and identity-based. The veil of ignorance, in this case, the physical screen, forcefully prevented System 1 from making snap demographic judgments and forced System 2 to evaluate the actual value being created, which was the music itself.
This seems like something every single company should be doing right now. We should be totally removing names from resumes. We should remove the names of the colleges they went to. Just look at the actual work product.
It is a profoundly powerful way to force our brains to be better. It stops bias dead in its tracks.
Okay, moving into part 3 of the book, Bazerman puts his Harvard Business School negotiation hat right back on. He talks about trade-offs and something he calls the fixed pie. This section really resonated with me because I personally hate conflict. I avoid it at all costs.
Many people do.
If you and I are going out and you want pizza and I really want tacos, I will almost always just suggest we get burgers because it feels fair to compromise. But Bazerman argues that compromise can actually be a massive waste of value.
Yes, it is. This is a classic textbook negotiation trap. The fixed pie myth is the deeply ingrained belief that there is only a strictly set amount of value available in any situation. For me to win a piece, you must necessarily lose a piece. It assumes everything is a zero-sum game.
Right. If we have a literal pie and I cut myself a bigger slice, you are mathematically forced to take a smaller slice.
But in most complex real-world situations, the pie can actually be expanded. It is not fixed. Bazerman tells a great relatable story about a couple trying to decide on a date night.
The dinner and a movie story. I feel like I have lived this exact argument 100 times in my own life.
Most of us have. So imagine this couple. One partner, let's call him Mark, really wants to go to his absolute favorite spot, Restaurant A. The other partner, Sarah, really wants to go to her favorite, Restaurant C. They argue back and forth. Neither wants to be selfish. They both want to be fair. So they agree to compromise and go to Restaurant B.
Which is, okay, it is edible, it is fine. But neither of them actually loves it. It is a completely mediocre experience for both of them.
Exactly. Then they have to discuss what movie to watch afterwards. Mark really wants to see a loud, action-packed sci-fi flick, movie D. Sarah really wants to see a quiet romantic comedy, movie F. Again, they argue. They want to be fair, so they compromise on an action comedy, movie E. Which, again, is just okay.
So they spend a bunch of money to have a totally mediocre dinner and watch a completely mediocre movie. But hey, they compromised, they were fair, they perfectly split the difference.
But they completely failed to realize that they actually had very different underlying preferences. If they had just paused and talked a bit more deeply, they might have learned that Mark is a massive foodie. He really, really cares about the quality of the dinner. That is his priority. But he is actually pretty indifferent about movies. He just likes sitting in the park and eating popcorn.
Okay, so Mark values the food way more than the film. And Sarah.
Sarah is a huge cinephile. She loves film. She's been dying to see that specific romantic comedy. She actually does not care much about food at all. She is perfectly happy eating whatever is put in front of her.
Ah, I see. So instead of compromising on everything, they should have traded off on their priorities.
Exactly. The elegant solution is a trade-off. Mark gets to pick his 10 out of 10 favorite restaurant. Sarah gets to pick her 10 out of 10 favorite movie. Mark gets his amazing dinner, Sarah gets her amazing movie.
Both of them get their ideal experience exactly where it matters the most to them.
Yes. They have effectively expanded the total happiness, the total size of the pie of their evening.
I think the technical term Bazerman uses for this is the Pareto efficient frontier.
That is the formal economic term, yes. Finding the Pareto-efficient frontier means finding the specific solution where absolutely no one can be made any better off without making someone else worse off. Their initial compromise was incredibly inefficient because there was a much better deal just sitting right there on the table.
Bazerman applies this concept to being a good person in a way that I found incredibly empowering. He says we often think morality is a zero-sum game between selfishness and altruism. Like, either I keep all my money and buy a luxury boat, or I give absolutely everything away and live in a cardboard box.
But he argues forcefully that we can expand the moral pie, too. We can find creative ways to create massive value for the world that also perfectly align with our own personal happiness, or at the very least do not destroy our happiness.
But on the flip side of that, he shows how terribly destructive we can be when we act tribally instead of trying to expand the pie. He brings up the whole Amazon HQ2 situation as a perfect case study in destroying value. Oh man, the Amazon bidding war. This was physically painful to watch unfold in the news.
It was a massive public social dilemma. Amazon publicly announces they want to build a second headquarters. They tease it out like a reality TV show. 238 different North American cities jump into the ring, and they spend millions and millions of taxpayer dollars just putting together the bids.
Just for the privilege of applying.
Right. They are hiring expensive consultants, printing glossy brochures, making Hollywood-style hype videos.
And then the financial incentives they offered were insane.
Unbelievable. New York City offered Amazon $1.7 billion in tax breaks. Other cities offered even more aggressive packages.
And Bazerman calls this a classic prisoner's dilemma, or a tragedy of the commons.
Exactly. Now let's step back and think about this from the perspective of our utilitarian North Star. Does Amazon moving its headquarters to New York City create significantly more total value for the world than if they moved to Chicago or Atlanta?
Probably not much of a difference globally. The jobs are still created somewhere, the packages still get delivered, the total value is roughly the same.
Exactly. The real value Amazon creates is the employment and the logistics network. The specific geographic location is totally secondary to the global value. But by purposely forcing all these cities to blindly bid against each other, the cities end up transferring massive amounts of public wealth tax money that should have gone to public schools, fixing roads, funding hospitals, straight to a highly profitable private corporation.
So the cities are literally cannibalizing their own internal value just to get the superficial win of landing the headquarters.
It creates enormous waste. From a global utilitarian perspective, the whole spectacle is a disaster. The total value of the system actually goes down because that $1 billion in tax money is far less efficient sitting in Amazon's corporate treasury than it would be funding public infrastructure. Amazon gains a little bit, but the public loses a tremendous amount. The pie drastically shrinks.
Speaking of shrinking pies and unnecessary waste,
Yeah.
Bazerman gets really specific about food waste in the book, and he introduces us to a woman named Rachel Atchison.
Rachel is a fascinating example of someone truly living the better, not perfect philosophy in a way that aggressively breaks social norms. Bazerman tells a story about having lunch with her at a conference. At the end of the meal, she just calmly started packing up the leftovers into containers. But she wasn't just packing up her own plate.
Wait, she was packing up other people's leftovers from the restaurant.
Yes, she was going around to nearby tables where colleagues had been sitting, and she was gathering up the half-eaten food that was about to be thrown in the trash so she could give it to her friends later or to people who needed a meal.
That is, wow, that is bold. I would be so completely paralyzed by embarrassment to do something like that in a public restaurant.
It is definitely an extreme example. Most people would cringe. But it perfectly highlights Bazerman's point. She saw that leftover food purely as value. It contained calories, nutrients, energy. Allowing it to be thrown in the trash was actively destroying value. It was mathematically irrational. So her system 2 simply overrode her system 1's social awkwardness.
And the statistics he presents on food waste, especially regarding the beef industry, are just staggering. He really hammers home the extreme inefficiency of eating meat.
The statistics on beef production are virtually impossible to ignore if you care at all about efficiency or utilitarian value. Globally speaking, it takes roughly 100 calories of grain to produce just one single calorie of beef for human consumption. In the US, the ratio is a bit better, maybe 40 to 1 because of factory farming efficiencies. But just think about that ratio. It is a massive systemic destruction of energy.
So if a human just eats the grain directly, the system is 40 to 100 times more efficient at feeding people.
Roughly, yes.
Hmm.
The energy loss is profound. And this is exactly where Bazerman sees a massive ray of hope in modern technology. He talks extensively about companies like Impossible Foods and the development of clean, lab-grown meat. He frames this as the ultimate better, not perfect solution.
Right, because the perfect solution, the normative philosopher solution, would be to demand that every single person on Earth immediately stop eating meat today.
Which we know for a fact is simply not going to happen. It requires far too much individual willpower. It fights directly against thousands of years of human culture, tradition, and biological taste preferences. People love burgers.
So lecturing them doesn't work.
No. So Bezerman says, let's use innovation to expand the pie. If we can engineer plant-based meat that tastes exactly as good, costs the same, and bleeds like a real burger, then people can be better, meaning they radically reduce animal suffering and their carbon footprint without actually having to be perfect, which would mean giving up the sensory experience they enjoy.
The consumer still gets the flavor they crave, and the environment gets a massive break. It is a win-win. The pie expands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is what a truly sustainable, ethical solution looks like.
Now, in order to actually be better, we have to be able to see these problems in the first place. And this leads us to part 4 of the book, which he titles The Moral Obligation to Notice. Honestly, this whole chapter felt like a heavy punch straight to the gut.
It is arguably one of the most convicting and challenging chapters in the entire book. He leans on this concept from Saul Bellow and Warren Bennis about becoming what they call a first-class noticer.
I really love that title. A first-class noticer. It sounds like a detective.
Most of us just sleepwalk through life with heavy blinders on. We see exactly what we want to see. We see whatever confirms our pre-existing biases. But a first-class noticer deliberately trains themselves to see what is actually there in reality, even if it is deeply uncomfortable, even if it directly threatens their worldview or their paycheck.
The Bernie Madoff example is the centerpiece here. We all know the story. Madoff stole billions of dollars in the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. But Bazerman points out that the real systemic tragedy isn't just Madoff's individual criminality. It is how many incredibly smart people saw the data and chose to do absolutely nothing.
The financial returns he was promising and claiming to deliver were mathematically impossible. The line on his performance graph was practically a straight 45-degree angle pointing up month after month, year after year, through every market condition.
Which just doesn't happen.
It never happens in real finance. Real markets fluctuate, they go down. Madoff's chart never went down.
So all the financial experts reviewing his funds had to know something was wrong.
Yes, brilliant financial analysts saw it. Major Wall Street banks saw it. The massive feeder funds that funneled client money to him saw it. The data was glaringly obvious. But they did not speak up. They actively chose not to investigate deeply.
Why? Why risk it?
Bazerman calls it motivated blindness. It simply did not benefit them financially to look too closely under the hood. They were making enormous fees. The feeder funds were getting incredibly rich just acting as middlemen for Madoff. If they opened their eyes, did their jobs as first-class noticers, and called it a fraud, their own personal money train would immediately derail.
So the moral failure wasn't just the criminal mastermind at the top. It was the entire surrounding ecosystem of enablers who refused to notice the crime simply because it was profitable for them to stay willfully blind.
Exactly. And Bazerman draws parallels to Theranos, the fake blood testing company. He draws parallels to the Volkswagen emissions cheating scandal. In all these cases, the data was blatantly too good to be true, but people badly wanted it to be true, so they completely stopped noticing the massive red flags.
And this connects directly to his very specific definition of corruption.
Yeah.
He defines corruption in a really interesting, broad way. It is not just the movie version of handing a politician a briefcase full of cash in a dark parking garage.
Right, that is overt bribery. Bazerman defines corruption much more subtly as any time someone places a special interest, usually their own profit, above the North Star of creating global value. And a huge part of this modern corruption is a tactic called obfuscation.
Obfuscation.
Huh?
That is such a great slippery word.
It means deliberately creating systemic confusion in order to delay meaningful action. The tobacco industry famously did this for decades. They realized they did not actually have to scientifically prove that smoking was safe. They just had to fund enough conflicting studies to create a fog of doubt so the government wouldn't regulate them.
They just muddied the waters.
Yes. Exxon and the fossil fuel industry use the exact same playbook with climate change. They knew the internal science was clear, but they spend millions funding doubt and obfuscation.
That is value destruction on an absolutely massive planetary scale. It successfully delayed global climate solutions by decades.
And then he turns his sights on the Sackler family, the billionaire owners of Purdue Pharma, the company that aggressively marketed OxyContin and helped ignite the opioid crisis. And this brings up his fascinating concept of conducting a net value audit.
Because the Sacklers are famously huge philanthropists, right? Their name is etched on museum walls, on hospital wings, on elite universities all over the world. They have given hundreds of millions of dollars to the arts.
Yes, so a very superficial utilitarian, someone just looking at the donation receipts might say, well, look at all the objective good they did for culture and education. They fund the arts. But Bazerman says you have to run the hard net value calculation. You have to take all the good they created, the beautiful museum wings, and you mathematically subtract the immense harm they caused to create that wealth. The addiction, the millions of ruined lives, the shattered communities, the overdose deaths.
And obviously the moral math does not look good for the Sacklers.
It is overwhelmingly, devastatingly negative. They destroyed infinitely more value than they ever created. Bazerman argues that we need to rigorously audit powerful people, and crucially, we need to audit ourselves based on this total net value, not just the glossy highlight reel of our charitable donations. You simply cannot buy your way out of being a massive value destroyer just by writing a check for a museum wing.
That brings us to part 5, which tackles the incredibly tricky topic of tribalism. And this is where the book gets really personal and challenging for a lot of us, because we all have tribes. We have our family, our country, our religion, our university alumni group.
And as we discussed earlier, evolution deeply wired us to be this way. We survived the harsh ancestral environment by fiercely protecting our small local group. If you did not prioritize your tribe over strangers, your genes did not survive. But in a modern, hyper-connected, globalized world, that ancient tribalism creates massive systemic ethical failures.
He brings up this fascinating and somewhat disturbing study about mortgage loan officers to illustrate this.
Yeah.
Because we usually think of discrimination and racism as being driven by active hostility, right? Like actively hating the other group.
Right. But the study Bazerman highlights showed something much more subtle and insidious. White loan officers were not necessarily showing active hostility to black mortgage applicants. They did not have conscious hate in their hearts when reviewing the files. But they consistently gave the benefit of the doubt to white applicants.
I see. So if a white applicant had a slightly borderline credit score or a small gap in their employment history, the loan officer would look at it and say, he seems like a good guy. He just hit a rough patch. Let's approve it. But for the black applicant with the exact same borderline score,
They would suddenly become strict rule followers. They would say, sorry, the score is mathematically too low. I cannot approve this.
so the systemic discrimination wasn't necessarily driven by active malice toward the black applicant. It was driven by active tribal favoritism toward the white applicant.
Exactly. It is called in-group favoritism. And Bazerman points out that this is often much harder to fight than open, aggressive racism, precisely because it internal feels like being nice. The loan officer just thinks they're helping out a guy who reminds them of their brother. They feel good about it. But the net societal result is profound systemic inequality.
He also aggressively attacks the practice of legacy admissions at elite universities, which, when you really think about it and say it out loud, is literally just affirmative action for wealthy, connected people.
It absolutely is. It is a structural mechanism designed specifically to keep valuable resources and opportunities tightly locked within the existing tribe. Bazerman contrasts this deeply ingrained tribal behavior with the radical philosophy of Peter Singer.
Peter Singer. He is kind of the godfather of hardcore utilitarianism.
He is. Singer forcefully argues for a concept called the equality of interests. This means that, from a strictly moral perspective, pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. It fundamentally does not matter if the suffering is happening to your next-door neighbor or to a complete stranger living in South Sudan. It doesn't even matter if it is happening to a human or a farm animal. The underlying interest in avoiding pain is totally equal.
See, that is a really hard pill for me to swallow. Because if I am being totally honest, I care way more about my neighbor than I do about someone thousands of miles away in South Sudan. My System 1 gut reaction screams that my neighbor matters more to me.
And Bazerman completely acknowledges that reality. He is a realist, remember. He does not demand that you magically stop loving your neighbor or your children. He simply says you need to intellectually recognize that your System 1 is heavily biased by proximity. If you genuinely want to be better, you have to deliberately engage System 2 and push yourself to stretch that circle of moral care just a little bit wider.
So I don't have to be perfect.
No, you do not have to treat your own child exactly like a random stranger. That is impossible. But the question is, can you try to treat the stranger just a little bit more like a neighbor?
That reframing seems much more achievable. It is just stretching the circle outward, not trying to completely rewrite human nature.
Precisely. And this leads us perfectly into the most practical, actionable part of the entire book, part 6, philanthropy and effective altruism.
This is where we are introduced to Ian Ross. And I have to say, this guy is incredibly intense.
Ian Ross is the living embodiment of perfection that Bazerman warns might actually scare normal people away from trying to be better. Ian is what the effective altruism community calls an extreme earner-to-giver. He lived in San Francisco on roughly $10,000 a year.
Living in San Francisco on $10,000 a year sounds mathematically impossible.
He made it work by living with multiple roommates, staying in the cheapest possible areas, and eating an incredibly simple, repetitive diet. The catch is, he was earning huge amounts of money working in the tech sector, and he was voluntarily donating 95% of his entire income to highly effective charities.
95%. I mean, that is literal saint-level commitment to the cause.
It is deeply admirable. But Bazerman asks a very practical question here. Does holding up someone like Ian Ross as the moral standard actually inspire the rest of us to give more? Or does it just make us feel like absolute failures so we just throw our hands up and do nothing?
Yeah, if the standard for being a good person is living on rice and beans and giving away 95% of my paycheck, I am out. I am keeping my latte and my Netflix subscription. I just cannot hit that bar.
Exactly. And that is the inherent danger of demanding perfection. It paralyzes people. So Bazerman advocates for the principles of effective altruism, but applying them in a much more sustainable, realistic way. And a big part of that is tackling what he calls the overhead myth, which I know is a trap a lot of our listeners struggle with when choosing charities.
Oh, I have definitely fallen for this trap. I will go on a site like Charity Navigator, and I will see, oh, Charity X spends 20% of their budget on administrative overhead, but Charity Y only spends 10%. So obviously, I will donate to Charity Y because they are more efficient.
It feels like the responsible, analytical choice, but Bazerman says it is fundamentally the wrong metric to look at. And think about it this way. Imagine a charity that prides itself on incredibly low overhead. They spend almost nothing on administration. As a result, they have ancient computers, exhausted, low-paid staff, and absolutely zero marketing budget.
Okay, they are lean.
Yes, but because they are so starved for resources, they achieve almost nothing. They print out a few flyers that no one ever reads.
Right.
Now compare them to a different charity tackling the same issue. This charity has high overhead. They spend money aggressively to hire the absolute best scientific talent away from the private sector. They pay competitive corporate salaries. They fund expensive, cutting-edge research facilities. Their overhead is huge. But because of that talent and infrastructure, they actually discover a cure for a major disease. Which charity is actually better?
Well, obviously the one that cures the disease. The outcome is all that matters.
Exactly. We should evaluate charities based on their measurable impact, not their overhead ratio. If spending money on top-tier talent and marketing actually solves the underlying problem, then that is incredibly good utilitarian value. We need to look at the return on investment of our donation. How many lives were saved per dollar, not just the administrative cost percentage.
And when thinking about how we can help, we also need to understand the economic concept of comparative advantage. Bazerman pulls this from the economist David Ricardo.
Yes. This is the intellectual foundation for the earning to give model. Let's say you are a highly skilled, brilliant software engineer and you make $200,000 a year. You feel a moral calling to help the homeless. You could quit your lucrative job and go volunteer 40 hours a week chopping vegetables at a local soup kitchen.
Which sounds incredibly noble.
It does, but the reality is you might be a terrible cook. You might be incredibly slow at chopping carrots.
So I am actually destroying value in the kitchen. I am slow, I am getting in the way of the real cooks, and I am clogging up the line.
Effectively, yes, your direct contribution is very low. But if you stayed at your demanding software job, earned that massive salary, and simply donated a significant portion of it to that same soup kitchen, They could take your money and hire 3 full-time professional chefs who can chop carrots 10 times faster than you ever could.
So my personal comparative advantage is writing complex code and generating cash, not physically chopping carrots. I do the most good by doing what I am best at.
Exactly. Bazerman is saying, do not just do what gives you that immediate warm glow of volunteering. Do the cold math. Figure out what action actually generates the maximum amount of resources to solve the problem.
And Bazerman says we should regularly audit our own giving behavior. We should look back at the past year and ask, did I give to that specific charity just because they sent me a really sad photo of a dog in the mail, which is pure system one? Or did I give because I actually sat down, did the objective research, and found the organization with the highest measurable impact, engaging system two?
Most of us are entirely reactive givers. We give when we are asked or when we are emotionally triggered. Shifting from being a reactive giver to a proactive, deliberate giver is one of the absolute easiest, most powerful ways to instantly be better.
So we have covered the brain science, the cognitive biases, the wasted value in negotiations, and the complexities of philanthropy. How does Bazerman pull all these threads together into a cohesive lifestyle? He ends the book with this beautiful concept of maximum sustainable goodness, and he uses an analogy from the fishing industry.
Yes, the concept of maximum sustainable yield. Imagine you are a commercial fisherman managing a lake. If you fish too aggressively, if you try to catch absolutely every single fish in the lake right now to maximize your short-term profit, what
You
happens?
completely deplete the breeding stock, the fish population collapses,
Yeah.
and next year you catch zero fish.
Yeah.
The whole system dies.
Exactly. You burn out the underlying resource. Bazerman brilliantly applies this exact concept to our own personal morality. If you try to be Ian Ross overnight, if you try to give away 95% of your money, eat a zero-impact diet, never drive a car, never buy anything nice for yourself ever again, you might last a month.
If that,
Right. Then you will completely burn out, your willpower will collapse, and you will probably rebound into a state of total apathetic selfishness because you made yourself utterly miserable trying to be perfect.
so maximum sustainable goodness is about finding that long-term sweet spot.
It is finding the absolute highest level of ethical behavior and giving that you can realistically sustain and actually enjoy for the rest of your natural life. It is not about ascetic suffering. It is about intentionally designing a lifestyle of goodness that you can happily maintain decade after decade without burning out.
I really love that he explicitly includes the word enjoy in there, because if you secretly hate your life and resent your own moral choices, you are simply not going to be very effective at helping others in the long run.
Absolutely not. And you can also use what he calls multipliers to drastically increase your positive impact without significantly increasing the personal cost to yourself.
Like the concept of nudging.
Yes. If you are in a position of power, say a manager or an HR director, you can simply change the default settings. You can make the company retirement savings plan opt out instead of opt in. You can make the company cafeteria default to serving healthy, sustainable plant-based food, and people have to special request the meat. With one single administrative decision, you are effortlessly helping hundreds of people make better choices.
Or you can multiply your impact by influencing your social network. He talks a lot about his wife, Marla Felcher, in this context.
Marla is a master of this. She doesn't just quietly write a check to a charity, she actively creates networks of giving. She organizes. If you can convince 10 of your reasonably wealthy friends to be just 10% more generous this year, you have effectively multiplied your own personal impact by 10. That is incredibly high leverage ethics.
So the final step in all of this is the personal audit. Bazerman says we should regularly audit ourselves, but not as a tool to beat ourselves up over our failures.
No, guilt is not productive. It is just a calibration check-in. You sit down at the end of the year and ask yourself a few simple questions. Did I create more net value for the world this year than I did last year? Did I notice and actively reduce my own waste? Did I successfully catch and overcome a tribal bias in my decision-making?
And Bazerman is refreshingly honest here. He admits that he himself is still far from perfect.
That is honestly the most charming and reassuring part of the entire book. Here is this Harvard ethicist admitting that he still occasionally eats dairy because he likes it. He admits he does not donate 50% of his income yet, but, and this is the crucial part, he knows the math shows he is quantifiably better today than he was in 2018, and that forward progress is the win.
That is so deeply liberating. Just being better than I was last year, that is a goal I can actually wrap my head around.
It fundamentally turns ethics from a pass-fail test that you are constantly failing into a lifelong journey of incremental growth.
So let's try to wrap this whole deep dive up.
Yeah.
We've unpacked a massive amount of material today. We have looked at the runaway trolleys, the dueling systems of the brain, the myth of the fixed pie, the tragedy of tribalism. Out of all of this, what is the single biggest thing you want the listener to take away today?
For me, the core lesson is learning to recognize the moments that truly matter and deliberately shifting from system one to system two in those moments. We have to stop blindly trusting our gut on major ethical questions. Our gut is deeply tribal, it cannot do math, and it is riddled with evolutionary biases.
We have to engage the calculator.
Yes, we have to use our rational brains. We need to actively use tools like joint evaluation. We need to mentally put ourselves behind the veil of ignorance. We have to compare our options side by side and actually do the hard calculation. Real effective compassion requires doing the math.
I absolutely love that phrasing. Real compassion requires doing the math. For me, the biggest takeaway is just the profound permission to be imperfect. I can finally be a realist about my own goodness. I do not have to solve every single problem in the world today. I just have to find my own maximum sustainable goodness and stick to it.
And if everyone listening to this just did that, if everyone just maximized their own sustainable level of goodness without burning out, the world would be drastically, unimaginably better than it is right now.
So here is my final challenge to you, the listener. Pick just one single tool that we talked about today. Maybe it is joint evaluation the next time you are hiring someone at work, or even just buying a major appliance. Force yourself to compare 3 options side by side.
Or try the audit.
Exactly. Look at your charitable giving for the year and honestly ask yourself, did I give this money because it made me feel good in the moment? Or did I give it because the math proves it actually does the most good? Or maybe just try to be a first-class noticer this week. Just look around. Look for the invisible waste. Look for the systems that just do not make sense.
And as you go about your week, I want you to ask yourself this one final provocative question. If you started treating your charitable decisions with the exact same ruthless rigor, research, and intelligence that you apply to your financial investment decisions, how much more actual value could you create for the world?
Wow. That is definitely a question worth sleeping on. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, do not paralyze yourself trying to be perfect. Just go out there and try to be a little bit better. Keep diving deep.
See you next time.